So this is your urgent meeting, Adrian? Feeding cake to your pregnant mistress while our son watches? Adrian's face drained as he stammered. Nova, please. This isn't what it looks like. Lena froze, a hand on her stomach, whispering, You, you told me you were divorced. Nova didn't raise her voice. She simply smiled, cold, steady, unshakable, before taking Micah's hand and saying, Good, then let everyone see the truth. If you were standing in Nova's place, what would you have done? Stay silent or expose everything? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The scent of rosemary and roasted garlic, usually a harbinger of warmth and familial comfort, seemed to die the moment it crossed the threshold of the Cole family's cavernous dining room, where the air was always chilled to a sterile temperature that preserved the expensive art but froze the soul. Nova Ellis stood at the head of the mahogany table, her hands smoothing the imaginary wrinkles from her simple apron, watching as the steam rose from the herb-crusted lamb rack she had spent the better part of the afternoon perfecting. A labor of love that felt increasingly like a sacrificial offering to gods who had already decided to reject it. The silence in the room was not empty, but heavy, weighted down by the judgmental stares of the portraits on the walls and the living critics seated before her, waiting for a mistake to materialize so they could dissect it with the same precision they applied to their corporate mergers. Evelyn Cole, a woman whose approval Nova had spent 6 years chasing in vain, adjusted her diamond-encrusted reading glasses to inspect the centerpiece dish with the clinical detachment of a coroner examining a corpse, her manicured fingers hovering over the porcelain platter without actually making contact, as if fearing that the rustic nature of the food might somehow contaminate her pristine skin. Nova swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, placing the serving spoon down with a gentle click that echoed too loudly in the vast space, saying softly, I roasted the lamb exactly the way Adrian likes it, with the extra time and the garlic confit he used to ask for when we first started dating. Without looking at her daughter-in-law, Evelyn picked up her linen napkin and dabbed at the corner of her mouth, her eyes still fixated on the meat with a mixture of pity and disdain, before she finally spoke in that polished, lethal tone that sounded like silk sliding over a knife edge, noting, This dish, it is rather heavy on the spices, isn't it? A bit too pungent for a Tuesday evening. I suppose I keep forgetting, dear, that you have always preferred things that are bold and rustic, which I imagine is quite fitting given your background and where you come from. The insult was wrapped in courtesy, as it always was, designed to remind Nova that she was a guest in her own marriage, a temporary occupant who had stumbled into a palace she didn't deserve. But before Nova could formulate a defense that wouldn't sound defensive, Paige, her sister-in-law, let out a short, sharp laugh from the other side of the table while scrolling through her phone with bored indifference. Paige didn't even look up as she swirled her wine glass, her voice dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never having been told no in one's entire life, as she remarked, Don't worry, Mother, because Adrian's palate has certainly evolved since those quaint early days. Or haven't you noticed that, sister-in-law? He has developed a taste for things that are far more refined and less homemade. Nova felt her grip on the chair tighten until her knuckles turned white, her heart skipping a beat as she asked, What is that supposed to mean, Paige? To which the younger woman merely shrugged, feigning innocence while her eyes danced with malicious amusement, replying, Oh, nothing really. It's just that I've seen his car parked outside Le Rêve quite a bit lately, the French place downtown with the 3-month waiting list, so I just assumed you knew he was dining out more often. The conversation might have spiraled further if not for the heavy oak front door creaking open, signaling the arrival of the man around whom this entire solar system of dysfunction orbited. Yet when Adrian walked into the dining room, the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened and his eyes avoiding the table entirely. But as Nova moved to greet him, intending to kiss his cheek, she was stopped by a wall of invisible ice and a scent that made her stomach churn. A cloying, floral sweetness that certainly wasn't the sandalwood cologne she bought him for Christmas, clinging to his lapel like a second skin. He sidestepped her affection with practiced ease, muttering about a long day and a headache, and immediately placed his phone face down on the sideboard, a new habit that screamed of concealment more loudly than any password protection ever could. Dinner passed in a blur of clinking silverware and suffocating silence, with Nova feeling less like a wife and more like a waitress who had lingered too long at a private party, until she finally excused herself to escape the suffocating scrutiny of the adults and sought refuge in the one room in the mansion where she felt like a human being: Micah's bedroom. The nursery was a sanctuary of warm yellow light and scattered toys, a stark contrast to the museum-like quality of the rest of the house. And as Nova sat on the edge of the bed to tuck in her 6-year-old son, she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to dissolve, replaced by the fierce, protective love that had kept her grounded in this hostile environment for so long. Micah, sleepy-eyed and smelling of baby shampoo and innocence, yawned and reached under his pillow to pull out a crumpled piece of construction paper, proudly presenting his latest masterpiece with the unbridled enthusiasm that only a child possesses. Nova took the drawing, smiling at the wobbly stick figures, identifying herself by the curly hair and Adrian by the blue tie. But her smile faltered and froze when she noticed a fourth figure drawn in the corner: a woman with bright yellow hair and a comically large round stomach standing next to her husband. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs with a violence that made her breathless, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the crayon lines. And she asked with a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater, "Micah, baby, who is this standing over here in the corner? The one with the big tummy?" Micah rubbed his eyes, fighting sleep, and delivered the sentence that would shatter Nova's world more completely than any insult from Evelyn or sneer from Paige ever could, answering matter-of-factly, "That's Daddy's special friend, the one we saw the other day, because Daddy said she's sick, and that's why her tummy is so big." The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the air suddenly too thin to breathe, and Nova had to use every ounce of her willpower to keep her voice steady, to not scream, to not terrify her son, as she whispered the question she didn't want the answer to, asking, "Daddy, he took you to meet her?" Micah nodded, his eyelids drooping, completely unaware that he was holding a grenade that had just detonated in his mother's hands, and murmured softly, "Yes, but Daddy said it's a man's secret, just between us. So please don't be mad, Mommy, because Daddy says all men need secrets, and you wouldn't understand." Nova sat there in the dim light long after Micah's breathing had evened out into the rhythm of deep sleep, clutching the drawing to her chest as if it were a physical wound, the innocent revelation replaying in her mind on an agonizing loop, confirming that the cracks in her family portrait were not just hairline fractures caused by a difficult mother-in-law, but deep structural breaks caused by a betrayal so profound it threatened to bring the entire house down around them. The morning sun that filtered through the heavy velvet drapes of the Cole estate offered no warmth to Nova Ellis, who moved through the motions of her daily routine with a mechanical detachment, her mind relentlessly replaying the innocent yet devastating words her son had whispered the night before. The doubt Micah had planted was not merely a nagging thought, but a physical weight in her chest, expanding with every hour that Adrian remained distant. His eyes glued to his phone screen, and his body turned away from her as if she were a source of contagion rather than his wife of 6 years. When Evelyn, usually critical of Nova's every movement, suddenly suggested with uncharacteristic sweetness that Nova should take the afternoon off to rest and stop overthinking, offering a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes, Nova felt less like she was being granted a reprieve and more like she was being ushered off a stage before the curtains were fully raised. Seizing the opportunity to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the mansion, Nova strapped Micah into the back seat of her modest sedan, desperate for the anonymity of the city streets where she wasn't judged by her lack of pedigree, though a gnawing instinct, sharp and insistent, guided her hands on the steering wheel toward the downtown district where the city's financial elite congregated. As they drove past the high-end boutiques and exclusive clubs that Adrian frequented, Nova told herself she was just showing Micah the sights, but her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs when she saw it. The unmistakable sleek silhouette of Adrian's custom midnight blue sports car, parked prominently in the valet zone of Le Rêve, the city's most pretentious French restaurant, Panic, cold and absolute, washed over her, urging her to keep driving, to preserve the fragile illusion of her marriage for just one more day. But the gravitational pull of the truth was too strong, forcing her to pull over to the curb with trembling hands. Through the expansive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows that separated the common world from the sanctuary of the wealthy, Nova's gaze locked onto a table in the secluded back corner, and what she saw there shattered the last remnants of her denial into irreparable dust. Adrian was sitting opposite a woman who looked painfully like a younger, more radiant version of Nova herself. Lena Hart, a woman whose blonde hair caught the recessed lighting like a halo, and whose heavily pregnant belly was prominently displayed in a fitted white dress, a visual echo of the life Nova thought she and Adrian were building together. The scene unfolding behind the glass was a grotesque pantomime of intimacy that Nova recognized with sickening clarity. Adrian was smiling, a genuine soft expression she hadn't seen directed at her in years, as he lifted a silver fork laden with decadent sponge cake toward the woman's mouth. Time seemed to warp and slow as Nova watched her husband, the man who had claimed to be too busy for family dinners, gently press his thumb against the corner of Lena's lip to wipe away a stray smear of cream, before bringing that same finger to his own mouth to taste the sweetness. A gesture of possessive tenderness that was so visceral, so exclusively theirs, that Nova felt as though he had reached through the glass and ripped the air from her lungs. Before she could process the magnitude of this betrayal, Micah, peering through the rear window, erupted with pure, unadulterated joy, squealing, "Daddy, look, Mommy, Daddy is eating cake!" His innocent voice piercing the bubble of Nova's shock. The sound of her son's happiness was the catalyst that transmuted her paralysis into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She realized in that moment that fleeing would only validate the narrative the Coles had written for her, that of the weak, simple outsider. So instead of crying, she unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the rear door to take Micah's small, trusting hand in hers, and marched toward the restaurant entrance like a soldier entering a war zone where she had nothing left to lose. The interior of Le Rêve was a hushed temple of gastronomy, smelling of truffles and old money. But the atmosphere shifted instantly as Nova walked in, her sensible heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor, cutting through the low hum of conversation as she navigated the maze of tables with laser focus. She didn't stop until she stood directly beside their table, her shadow falling over the couple like a judgmental eclipse, causing Adrian to look up, his face draining of color so rapidly it looked as though he had seen a ghost. The silver fork in Adrian's hand clattered onto the fine china with a sharp king that silenced the surrounding tables, his mouth opening and closing in a fish-like display of panic as he stammered, "Nova. M. Why? Why are you—" Unable to form a coherent sentence in the face of his worst nightmare, Nova didn't scream, didn't overturn the table, didn't give him the satisfaction of calling her hysterical. Instead, she smoothed her skirt and spoke with a voice that was terrifyingly calm, loud enough to carry to the curious onlookers pretending not to listen, saying, "Micah wants to say hello to his father, Adrian, so do you mind, or are you too busy meeting with a partner?" The woman, Lena, looked between the two of them with widening eyes, her hand instinctively going to protect her unborn child as the color fled her cheeks, and she whispered in a voice trembling with confusion, "Adrian, you said you had been divorced for 2 years, so who is this?" The revelation that Adrian had erased her existence entirely, rather than just cheating, struck Nova with the force of a physical blow, but she refused to bleed in public. Turning her gaze to Lena, Nova offered a smile that was devoid of warmth, sharp enough to cut glass, and replied, "I am his future ex-wife, apparently, and you must be the Cole family's latest investment project," her words dripping with a mixture of pity and scorn that made Lena shrink back into her chair. Adrian, recovering his senses but losing his dignity, scrambled to his feet and attempted to grab Nova's arm, hissing through gritted teeth, "Don't cause a scene here, Nova. Just go home and we will talk." But Nova shook him off with a look of such intense disgust that he actually recoiled. She bent down to Micah's eye level, ignoring the dozens of smartphones that had silently risen around the room to capture the fall of a titan, and said softly but clearly, "Look closely, Micah, because I want you to see that this is how Daddy works. This is what lies look like, ensuring the image of his father's cowardice would be imprinted on his memory forever." Then, straightening her spine until she stood taller than anyone else in the room, she took her son's hand and turned her back on the wreckage of her marriage, walking out of the restaurant not as a victim fleeing a crime scene, but as a woman who had just set fire to the bridge she was leaving behind. The ornate grandfather clock in the Cole family hallway struck midnight, its hollow chimes echoing like a death knell through the silent mansion. But inside the main living room, the air was thick with a tension that made the late hour feel irrelevant. Nova sat alone on a stiff, velvet armchair that had been positioned in the center of the room, isolated like a defendant in a medieval trial, while the rest of the Cole dynasty, Evelyn, Charles, Paige, Oliver, and a devastatingly silent Adrian, sat arrayed before her on the sprawling leather sofa, a united front of wealth and disdain. The room, usually a place of performative hospitality, had been transformed into a sterile interrogation chamber, where emotional bonds were dissected with surgical precision, and Nova could feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her chest, heavier than the humidity of the stormy night outside. Charles Cole, the patriarch whose only religion was the accumulation of power, didn't bother with pleasantries as he leaned forward, his eyes devoid of any familial warmth, and slid a thick, blue-bound legal document across the polished mahogany coffee table toward Nova, the sound of the paper rasping against the wood sounding like a blade being sharpened. He tapped the cover with a manicured fingernail, his voice a low rumble of authority that brooked no argument, stating simply, "Sign it, Nova, because we have prepared a settlement of $500,000, which is more than generous for someone of your standing, and should be enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life in that little neighborhood you came from, provided you don't get greedy." Nova stared at the document, her mind reeling not just from the insulting sum, which wouldn't even cover a year of Micah's tuition, but from the terrifying realization that the papers were dated 3 months prior, meaning this ambush had been meticulously planned while she was still cooking their dinners and folding their laundry. Her hands trembled as she reached out, not to take the pen, but to touch the cold surface of the file, asking with a voice that threatened to crack, "You? You have been planning this for months? All this time, while I was trying to be a part of this family, while I was raising your grandson? You were drafting my eviction notice?" Evelyn, sipping her herbal tea with the poise of a queen watching an execution, set her cup down with a delicate clink and sighed, her tone laced with a poisonous pity as she replied, "Oh, please don't play the victim now, dear, because it really doesn't suit you. And you must understand that Adrian needs a wife who knows how to stand beside him at diplomatic galas and board meetings, not a woman whose only talent is standing in the kitchen making casseroles." Lena. "Well, that girl comes from good stock. She understands our world, and she carries a bloodline that will strengthen the family brand, unlike yours." The cruelty of the words stole the breath from Nova's lungs, stripping away the last vestiges of her dignity. But it was Adrian's silence that cut the deepest, his gaze fixed firmly on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug, as if he could disappear into the weave. Desperate for a lifeline, for any sign of the man she had loved for 6 years, Nova turned her eyes to her husband, pleading softly, "Adrian, are you really going to sit there and say nothing? Are you going to let them price our marriage, our life together, at the cost of a used car? Are you going to let them call me unfit?" For a moment, Adrian shifted, his jaw clenching as if he might finally find a spine. But when he spoke, his voice was a pathetic whisper that didn't even carry across the room, murmuring, "Nova, please just do what is best for Micah, because Mom and Dad are right. You don't have the resources or the stability to raise him in the way a Cole should be raised. And Lena, she will make sure he is taken care of." That was the moment the last ember of love in Nova's heart was extinguished, snuffed out not by anger, but by a profound, chilling realization that the man sitting before her was a stranger, a coward hollowed out by his own privilege. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a powerful billionaire, but a frightened little boy in a man's suit. And the disgust that washed over her was strangely empowering, burning away her tears and leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. Charles, mistaking her silence for submission, pressed the pen toward her again, adding the final nail to the coffin of her marriage by threatening, "If you choose to fight this, Nova, know that we will use every dollar at our disposal to prove that you are mentally unstable, unfit, and incapable of caring for a child. And you will leave this marriage with nothing. No money, no house, and certainly no son." Nova stood up slowly, her legs feeling surprisingly steady, and she wiped the single tear from her cheek with a deliberate, almost defiant motion, looking from Charles to Evelyn, and finally resting her gaze on Adrian one last time. She knew she couldn't win this battle tonight, not when they held all the cards and she was just one woman against an empire. So she lowered her head in a performance of defeat that masked the fire igniting in her soul, and said in a voice that was quiet but unwavering, "Fine, give me one night to think about it, because all I want is for my son to have a good future. And if this is what it takes, then I need to process it." As she turned and walked out of the room, leaving the document unsigned on the table, the air in the room shifted, the family exchanging smug glances of victory, completely unaware that they hadn't broken her spirit, but had merely freed her from the illusions that had kept her bound to them. Nova climbed the stairs to her room, not to pack her bags in defeat, but to plan a war, her mind already racing with the knowledge that a cornered mother is the most dangerous creature on earth. And tomorrow, the simple wife would show them just how complex her revenge could be. The silence that draped over the Cole estate in the days following the kangaroo court was not peaceful. It was predatory, waiting for Nova to make the final mistake that would justify her total erasure from the family history. Nova played her part to perfection, moving through the marble corridors like a broken doll, her eyes cast down and her shoulders slumped, allowing Evelyn to smirk triumphantly whenever they crossed paths and permitting Adrian to avoid her gaze entirely, believing his wife had finally been crushed into submission. But behind the closed door of the guest room where she had exiled herself, Nova was not weeping. She was waiting, her senses heightened to a painful degree, listening to the house breathe and whisper its secrets. Late that Tuesday night, when the grandfather clock chimed 2, a sliver of light from the library spilled into the hallway, accompanied by the low, murmuring baritone of Charles Cole. Nova, her feet bare against the cold floor, crept toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and pressed herself against the shadows of the doorframe, her hand clutching her phone with a grip so tight her knuckles turned white. Inside, Charles was speaking to someone on speakerphone, the family's private doctor, a man whose ethics were as flexible as his fees, and his words floated out into the hallway with terrifying clarity, callous and transactional. "Just adjust the medical files, doctor, and add a few notes about postpartum depression that was never treated, perhaps some incidents of hysteria or paranoia over the last year," Charles instructed, his voice devoid of any moral hesitation. "The court needs to see a pattern of instability, because we cannot have a judge handing custody of a Cole heir to a woman who is mentally unfit." Nova felt bile rise in her throat, a wave of nausea washing over her at the sheer evil of their plan. They didn't just want to divorce her. They wanted to gaslight the world into believing she was insane, effectively severing her bond with Micah forever. With trembling fingers, she pressed the record button on her screen, capturing every damning syllable of Evelyn's voice chiming in from the background, adding, "Make sure to mention she has been hallucinating about Adrian's fidelity. It will make her accusations sound like delusions rather than facts." Once the voices died down, Nova retreated to her room, not to sleep, but to pack a single bag with the essentials, her fear calcifying into a cold, diamond-hard rage. The next morning, under the guise of visiting a therapist to process the separation, Nova drove past the gleaming skyscrapers of the financial district and parked in a grittier part of town, where the buildings were brick and the air smelled of exhaust and reality. She climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor of a walk-up, pushing open a door with frosted glass that read, Jonah Reed, Attorney at Law. The office was a chaotic explosion of books, files, and half-eaten takeout containers, a stark contrast to the sterile, museum-like perfection of the Cole mansion. But to Nova, it smelled like safety. Jonah was sitting behind a desk buried under paperwork, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a cheap turkey sandwich in one hand. But when he looked up and saw Nova standing there, pale but determined, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to intense protective focus. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply cleared a chair, listened to her story without interruption, and then took the phone she offered him. As the recording of Charles and the doctor played, the air in the small office grew heavy, Jonah's jaw tightening until a muscle feathered in his cheek. They are not just trying to win a lawsuit, Nova, Jonah said, his voice low and dangerous as he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. They want to destroy you, to dismantle your credibility so thoroughly that you can never speak against them again. He reached for the copy of the prenuptial agreement Nova had brought, a document she had signed 6 years ago without reading, trusting in Adrian's love. Jonah flipped through the pages with the speed of a man hunting for a weapon, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon until they stopped on a paragraph buried deep in the addendums. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face, the kind of smile a shark might give before biting. God, they are arrogant, he muttered, turning the document around to point at a block of text. Look at this, Nova, right here, the morality clause. Nova leaned in, frowning. What does that mean? Jonah tapped the paper emphatically. It was standard boilerplate for high-profile families a decade ago, designed to protect them from scandal, but they got lazy and didn't update it for you specifically. It states that if the spouse, that's Adrian, engages in public infidelity that damages the marital honor or uses joint assets to fund an extramarital affair, the clauses protecting his separate property become void. He looked up at her, his eyes blazing with the thrill of the kill. Nova, do you have those bank alerts you told me about? Nova nodded, pulling up the screenshots she had taken of the joint account notifications. Thousands of dollars spent at jewelers, hotels, and travel agencies, all time-stamped during times Adrian claimed to be working. Jonah laughed, a sharp, triumphant sound. He used the joint account, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. He was so disrespectful of you, so sure you were too simple to check the finances, that he didn't even bother to hide the money trail. He leaned back in his creaking chair, looking at her with a mixture of pride and challenge. They think you are a sheep, Nova, waiting to be led to the slaughter, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But they forgot that a sheep is harmless until you threaten its lamb. The morality clause means you don't have to leave with their pity money. You have the legal right to claim half of the marital assets in full custody based on his breach of contract. Nova stared at the papers, the realization washing over her like a tidal wave. She wasn't helpless. She held the match that could burn their entire kingdom to the ground. Jonah leaned forward, locking eyes with her. This is going to be ugly, and they will come at you with everything they have, he warned, though his eyes sparkled with anticipation. Do you dare to play big, simple girl? Nova thought of Micah's drawing, of the cake on Adrian's finger, of Charles's voice planning to call her crazy, and the last of her hesitation evaporated. She reached out and placed her hand on the file, her voice steady and cold as steel. For Micah, she said, I will burn that entire mansion down if I have to. The conference room on the 45th floor of the Cole Enterprises Tower was a fortress of glass and steel, designed to make anyone sitting on the wrong side of the table feel insignificant, suspended in the clouds where the air was thin, and Charles Cole played God. Nova sat in the uncomfortable, low-backed chair reserved for the opposition, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Wearing a simple beige cardigan that made her look exactly like the unimaginative housewife they believed her to be, while across the expanse of the polished obsidian table, the entire Cole dynasty sat in their tailored Italian suits, radiating an air of bored impatience. They had arrived expecting a capitulation, a quick signature on a document that would strip Nova of her son and her dignity in exchange for a pittance, and the atmosphere in the room was less like a legal negotiation and more like a slaughterhouse waiting for the lamb to stop bleeding. The family's lead attorney, a man with a smile as sharp as a shark's fin, slid the final divorce decree across the table with a dismissive flick of his wrist, clicking a gold fountain pen and offering it to Nova as if he were doing her a favor. "Ms. Ellis, the pen is here," he said, checking his watch with an exaggerated sigh. "Please sign quickly so we can all move on with our lives and let my clients go to their lunch reservation." Charles tapped his fingers rhythmically on the table, a sound that echoed like a ticking bomb, his eyes fixed on the horizon behind Nova, as if she had already ceased to exist in his world. Nova reached for the pen, but before her fingers could graze the gold barrel, Jonah Reed's hand shot out, intercepting the movement and pushing the lawyer's hand back with a force that startled the room into silence. "I apologize," Jonah said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a sledgehammer. "But my client will not be signing a document that effectively sells her child. However, since you were kind enough to prepare this meeting, we have a different sort of gift for you." Before the confused murmurs could fully form, Jonah placed a small, nondescript digital recorder on the center of the obsidian table and pressed play. The volume turned up to maximum capacity. The silence of the boardroom was shattered by the crackling, unmistakable baritone of Charles Cole, his voice echoing off the glass walls with grotesque clarity. "Just adjust the medical files, doctor. The court needs to see a pattern of instability. Make sure to mention she has been hallucinating. Simply paint her as a madwoman." The color drained from Charles's face so violently that he looked like a wax figure melting under heat, and he slammed his hands onto the table, standing up with a roar that shook the water glasses. "What the hell is this?" he screamed, his veneer of sophistication cracking to reveal the thug beneath. "You dared to trap me in my own home? That is illegal wiretapping." Jonah merely smiled, a cold, predatory expression that told Charles he had anticipated this outburst. Noting calmly that, in their state, one-party consent was perfectly legal, especially when documenting a conspiracy to commit fraud. While Charles sputtered in impotent rage, Nova reached into her tote bag and pulled out a stack of papers, sliding them toward Adrian, who had been shrinking into his chair as if trying to become invisible. "And this is for you, Adrian," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the trembling fear they were used to. "Do you remember that diamond tennis bracelet you bought for Lena last month? The one you claimed was a business expense?" Adrian stared at the bank statements, his eyes widening in horror as he realized what she was pointing at. "You used the credit card linked to my name to accumulate the reward points," she continued, her tone laced with a biting irony that made Paige gasp. "Thank you, Adrian, because without your pettiness, without your obsession with getting those airline miles, I wouldn't have the definitive proof that you used marital assets to fund your affair, triggering the morality clause in our prenuptial agreement." The room descended into chaos, the Cole family realizing that the simple wife had essentially just seized half of their liquid assets. But the final blow was yet to land. The heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open, and the silence that followed was absolute as Lena Hart walked in, flanked by Jonah's paralegal. Looking pale and exhausted, but carrying herself with a newfound, fragile resolve. Evelyn, who had been watching the financial destruction with a look of stunned horror, suddenly snapped back to reality, her face twisting into a mask of venomous fury as she hissed, "What are you doing here? I told you to keep your mouth shut and take the check." Lena didn't flinch, her gaze moving from the man who had lied to her to the woman who had tried to buy her silence, and finally resting on Nova, the only person in the room who had looked at her with humanity. "You want me to keep my mouth shut so you can steal my baby too?" Lena asked, her voice trembling, but gaining strength with every word. "You told me Nova was crazy, that she was dangerous, but then you offered me money to disappear just like you're trying to make her disappear. I would rather be a single mother struggling to survive than let my child carry the name of a family that treats people like livestock." The devastation was total. In the span of 10 minutes, the Cole dynasty had been stripped of its moral standing, its financial leverage, and its future reputation. Nova stood up, looking at the wreckage of the people who had tormented her for 6 years, Charles panting with rage, Adrian weeping silently into his hands, and Evelyn staring at Lena with pure hatred. and she felt a lightness she hadn't known was possible. She gathered her purse, signaling to Jonah that they were done, and looked Charles dead in the eye, delivering the final verdict. "You all said I was simple," she said, her voice ringing clear in the silent room. "And you were right. I am simple. Simple is, you get what you give. Simple is, debts are paid." As she turned to leave, Jonah opened the blinds, revealing a sea of news vans and reporters gathered below, hungry for the story of the billionaire family who tried to frame a mother, cementing the giant's fall for all the world to see. 6 months after the gavel fell in the High Court, obliterating the pristine reputation of the Cole dynasty with the force of a tidal wave, the late afternoon sun did not struggle to penetrate heavy velvet curtains or filter through cold museum-quality glass, but instead poured freely onto the porch of a modest bungalow on the edge of the city, bathing the peeling white paint and the overgrown marigold beds in a warm, forgiving gold. Nova Ellis knelt in the dirt, her hands devoid of the diamond rings that had once felt like handcuffs and covered instead in rich, dark soil, tending to her garden with a sense of peace that was so profound it felt almost physical, a stark departure from the anxiety that used to constrict her chest every time she heard a car door slam. This house, with its creaking floorboards and mismatched furniture, was not a fortress of wealth, but a sanctuary of life, where the air smelled of lemon zest and freedom rather than expensive potpourri and judgment, and where no staff with white gloves appeared to wipe away the fingerprints of a happy childhood. Inside, the sound of laughter, genuine, unbridled laughter, echoed from the living room, where Jonah Reed was helping Micah construct a complex fortress out of sofa cushions and cardboard boxes, a chaotic architectural endeavor that would have given Evelyn Cole a migraine, but gave Nova a sense of overwhelming gratitude. The news cycle had finally moved on from the scandalous collapse of Cole Enterprises. Though the fallout was still visible in the financial pages, Nova no longer bothered to read. Charles had been ousted by his own board, Evelyn was a pariah in the social circles she once ruled, and the family fortune had hemorrhaged in the wake of the public boycott, leaving them with their pride but very little else. Nova, however, had stopped measuring her worth by their failures and had started measuring it by the quiet rhythm of her own breathing, which remained steady even as a shadow fell across the picket fence at the edge of her property. She sensed him before she saw him, a lingering instinct from years of hypervigilance, and when she stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans, she saw Adrian standing on the sidewalk, looking like a ghost haunting a life he had voluntarily forfeited. He was unrecognizable from the arrogant billionaire who had sat across the table at Le Rêve. His signature, bespoke suit hung loosely on a frame that had grown gaunt. His tie was crooked, and the gray that now peppered his temples spoke of sleepless nights and a stress that money could no longer alleviate. He hesitated at the gate, his hand hovering over the latch as if he were afraid it would burn him, staring at Nova with a mixture of hunger and devastation that might have once moved her to pity, but now only stirred a distant, dispassionate curiosity. "I lost everything, Nova," Adrian said, his voice raspy and devoid of the polished cadence he used to employ to manipulate boardrooms and wives alike, his fingers gripping the weathered wood of the fence as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "My father wrote me out of the will to save his own skin. The partners canceled all my contracts, and even Lena left the city. I have been sleeping in a hotel room that is smaller than our old walk-in closet, and God, I miss the smell of your cooking. I miss the sound of you humming. I miss our home." Nova continued to hold her gardening shears, her posture relaxed but unyielding, refusing to invite him into the sanctuary she had built from the ashes of his arson. "That mansion was never my home, Adrian. Nor was it yours. It was a museum curated by your mother and a bank vault managed by your father, a golden cage where affection was a transaction and loyalty was conditional," she replied, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze, calm and devoid of bitterness. She gestured to the small house behind her, where the sound of Micah's giggles drifted through the screen door. "This structure behind me, with the mortgage I pay myself and the garden I planted with my own hands, this is a home because it is the one place on earth where no one is waiting for me to fail." Adrian flinched as if she had struck him, his eyes glistening with tears that were too little and far too late. I know I was weak. I know I let them control me. But please just give me a chance to fix this, he begged, leaning over the fence, reaching out a hand that Nova made no move to take. Micah needs a father, Nova. He needs a man in his life, and I am willing to change. I am willing to be simple if that's what you want. Nova looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that the anger she had carried for so long had evaporated, replaced by a clarity that was as sharp and bright as the sun above them. Micah does need a father, Adrian. That is true, she said softly, stepping closer to the fence but keeping the barrier firmly between them. He needs a father who is honest, who is brave, and who protects his family, not a billionaire who hides behind his parents and lies to his son. You had every opportunity to be that man when we lived under the same roof. You had 1,000 chances to choose us, and you used those chances to feed cake to another woman while your son watched from the window. The memory of the restaurant hung between them, the final, insurmountable wall that no apology could breach. Adrian slumped, the last of his hope extinguishing as he realized that the simple woman he had underestimated was actually a fortress he could not conquer. "So this is it?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You're just going to erase me?" "I didn't erase you, Adrian," Nova said, turning back to her marigolds. "You erased yourself the moment you decided I wasn't enough. Now please, the judge was very clear about the visitation schedule, so do not come here again unannounced and disturb my peace." She didn't watch him walk away, but she heard the slow, heavy shuffle of his footsteps retreating down the pavement, the sound of a past life fading into silence. The screen door creaked open, and Micah stepped out onto the porch, holding a juice box, his eyes scanning the street where his father had just disappeared. He sat down on the top step, his small face thoughtful but not distressed, and asked with the blunt honesty of a child, "Mommy, are you sad that Daddy went away?" Nova walked up the steps and sat beside him, pulling him into a warm embrace that smelled of earth and sunshine. "No, my love," she said, kissing the top of his head and smiling as she watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of violet and orange. "I was sad a long time ago, back when I was trying to be someone I wasn't. But today I don't feel sad at all. I just feel light." From the doorway, Jonah appeared, holding 2 glasses of lemonade, his presence solid and grounding, devoid of any pressure or grand declarations. Just a friend who had helped her find her voice. He handed a glass to Nova and sat on the railing, the 3 of them sharing a comfortable silence that didn't need to be filled with words. Nova took a sip of the tart, cold drink and looked out at her small, imperfect garden, realizing that the Coles had been wrong about everything. Simple wasn't weak, and simple wasn't small. Simple was knowing exactly who you were. Simple was refusing to be devalued. And simple was the unbreakable strength of a woman who had walked through fire and come out holding her own hand. If this story stirred something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening and supporting these powerful journeys. See you in the next chapter. Stay strong, stay kind.